The Roman triumph of 71 CE was unlike any other in the empire's history. As prisoners shuffled through Rome's streets in chains, the crowd witnessed an entire nation being paraded as conquered property. Jewish captives, symbols of a civilization that had dared resist Roman authority, were displayed alongside treasures looted from their holiest sanctuary. This was not merely a celebration of military victory, but the public acknowledgement of Rome's systematic destruction of Judean independence and the beginning of punishment so severe they would scatter a people across the known world for nearly 2,000 years. Brutal siege and total destruction of Jerusalem. In April of 70 CE, 4 Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem. General Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, commanded at least 48,000 troops, and his timing was deliberate. The siege began just 3 days before Passover, when thousands of pilgrims had flooded into the city for the holy festival. What should have been a time of religious celebration became a death trap as Roman forces tightened their grip. Inside the city, rival Jewish factions led by John of Gischala, Simon bar Yochai, and Eleazar ben Simon had been locked in internal conflicts, destroying precious food supplies before the Romans even began their assault. But when Roman siege towers appeared, the factions finally united. Their resistance proved fierce but futile. The siege unfolded with methodical brutality. Roman engineers constructed massive earthworks, advancing steadily toward Jerusalem's fortifications. Each defensive wall that fell brought Roman forces closer to the Temple Mount. Inside, starvation claimed thousands as food supplies vanished. Those who attempted to flee were caught between their own defenders, who executed suspected deserters and Roman forces beyond the walls. Josephus, who witnessed these events, recorded scenes of desperate residents eating leather and worse. One woman, driven mad by hunger, reportedly committed an unspeakable act against her own infant. By late July, Roman forces breached the Antonia fortress. Then came one of history's most catastrophic acts of cultural destruction. On August 30th, 70 CE, the Second Temple caught fire. Jewish defenders rushed to save their holiest site with no thought for their lives, but Roman soldiers either ignored or disobeyed orders to preserve the structure. The temple, the center of Jewish worship and identity, was consumed in flames. Roman forces then systematically razed Jerusalem to the ground. Buildings were burned, walls demolished, and entire neighborhoods leveled. By September, the city lay in ruins. The Romans left standing only 3 towers from Herod's palace and a portion of the western wall, preserved solely to demonstrate what they had conquered. Josephus claimed over 1 million perished, though historians consider this exaggerated. Even conservative estimates place casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Mass enslavement following Judea's collapse. When Jerusalem fell, the Romans implemented a brutal sorting process. After executing armed defenders and the elderly, Roman forces processed the remaining population with cold efficiency. Approximately 97,000 Jews were enslaved. This figure represents not just soldiers, but civilians and families whose only crime had been living in a city that resisted Rome. Age determined destiny. Those under 17 were immediately separated and sold into servitude throughout the empire. Many never saw their families again. The strongest survivors faced a fate combining slavery with entertainment. Thousands were selected for the arena, forced to fight as gladiators or face wild animals for Roman crowds. This was not quick execution, but prolonged torment designed to remind audiences what happened to those who challenged Rome. Many died in mass executions staged as mythological reenactments, dressed as doomed heroes before being killed. Others were assigned to construction projects, memorializing their own defeat. Jewish captives provided forced labor for the Forum of Peace and, most ironically, for the Colosseum itself, where many of their fellow prisoners would later die for public entertainment. They built the monuments to their own subjugation. The rebel leaders who commanded Jerusalem's defense met grim ends. Simon bar Yochai eventually surrendered and was brought to Rome in chains. During the triumph of 71 CE, he was paraded through the streets before being taken to the Mamertine prison and executed by hanging. John of Gischala received life imprisonment, spending his remaining years as a living reminder of failed resistance, denied both freedom and the dignity of dying on his own terms. The enslaved population was scattered across the Roman Empire, shipped from Gaza to provinces, from Egypt to Spain. Archaeological evidence confirms this dispersion. A tombstone near Naples commemorates Claudia Astor, identified as a captive from Jerusalem. The poet Martial casually referenced owning a Jewish slave. These fragments reveal how thoroughly Rome integrated the conquered Jewish population into its economic system. Gruesome public executions of Jewish rebels. During the siege, Roman forces demonstrated cruelty that served both practical and psychological purposes. As starvation gripped Jerusalem, desperate inhabitants attempted to escape, hoping to find food beyond Roman lines. Those caught faced immediate punishment designed to terrorize defenders inside the walls. Crucifixion became Rome's weapon of psychological warfare. Josephus recorded that Roman soldiers crucified Jewish captives within sight of Jerusalem's walls. The numbers were staggering. Over 500 people were crucified daily at times, the executions continuing for months. The soldiers, consumed by rage at the stubborn resistance they had encountered, treated these deaths as grim entertainment. Roman legionaries began nailing victims in various positions. Some were hung upside down. Others had their arms stretched at different angles. Josephus described how soldiers amused themselves by experimenting with different configurations of torment. The variety served no purpose beyond psychological impact and the soldiers' own dark entertainment. Victims were first scourged, their bodies struck by whips embedded with metal or bone fragments, then forced to carry the crossbeam to the execution site. They were either tied or fastened through the wrists and feet. Archaeological evidence from a heel bone discovered in 1968 near Jerusalem revealed Roman executioners drove a 7.5-inch iron nail, securing both heel bones, bending the tip to prevent removal. Death by crucifixion was not swift. The position made breathing difficult, forcing victims to push up on their nailed feet to inhale, a cycle of agony lasting hours or days. Eventually, as Josephus recorded, the Romans ran out of wood for crosses and space to erect them. The landscape around Jerusalem became a forest of dying bodies, a warning visible for miles. The purpose extended beyond simple execution. Titus understood each crucifixion was a message to defenders inside Jerusalem's walls. The Romans hoped the site would break the will to resist. Even after Jerusalem fell, rebels captured in fighting were crucified along roads throughout Judea. Their bodies were left on display as warnings to any community harboring thoughts of resistance. Permanent ban on Jewish return to Jerusalem. Emperor Hadrian intended to ensure Jerusalem would never again serve as a rallying point for Jewish resistance. His solution was to erase the city's Jewish identity entirely. Jerusalem was rebuilt as Syria Capitolina, a Roman colony whose very name proclaimed its new allegiance. The city was redesigned with broad colonnaded streets, arched gateways, and forums. Where the Jewish temple had stood, Hadrian erected a temple to Jupiter Capitolinus. A formal edict banished Jews from entering the city. This was not a temporary military restriction, but a permanent legal prohibition. Jews were forbidden from living in or even visiting their holiest city. The ban was absolute, enforced by Roman authorities, viewing any Jewish presence as a security threat. The Romans permitted only one exception designed to reinforce Jewish defeat. Once yearly, on the 9th of Av, the day the Second Temple had been destroyed, Jews were allowed to enter and mourn at what remained of the Temple Mount. This annual pilgrimage became a ritual of grief, with Jews lamenting their losses while surrounded by the pagan city that had replaced Jerusalem. Jerome described these gatherings in the 4th century, noting elderly Jewish pilgrims covered in years and rags, weeping over ruins of their former glory. Hadrian renamed the province from Judea to Syria Palaestina, deliberately choosing a name associated with the ancient Philistines, enemies of the Jews. This was not mere administrative reorganization, but symbolic annihilation. The Romans sought to remove even the geographic nomenclature connecting the land to its Jewish inhabitants. This renaming would have lasting consequences, as Palestine derives directly from Syria Palaestina. The ban on Jewish residence in Jerusalem remained in effect for centuries, persisting through the Christianization of the Roman Empire under Constantine. Only with the Muslim conquest in 636 CE did this ban finally end. Though nearly 500 years had passed since Jews were allowed to live in their former capital. This systematic exclusion created a permanent diaspora mentality. For the first time in their history, Jews constituted a people without a political homeland, scattered across the Roman Empire and beyond. Communities developed in Spain, North Africa, Italy, Babylonia, and Arabia, each maintaining religious traditions while adapting to local conditions. The temple's destruction and permanent expulsion from Jerusalem necessitated the development of Rabbinic Judaism, which centered religious life on study, prayer, and community rather than temple sacrifice and pilgrimage. The consequences of Rome's actions in 70 and 135 CE extended far beyond immediate violence and displacement. They fundamentally altered Jewish existence, transforming a people primarily concentrated in their ancestral homeland into a dispersed minority. This diaspora existence, initially imposed by Roman force, would define Jewish life for the next 18 centuries, ending only with the establishment of modern Israel in 1948. Which aspect of this historical strikes you as most devastating? The physical destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, the mass enslavement and executions, or the permanent exile that followed? The Roman campaign succeeded in its immediate military objectives, but ultimately failed to destroy Jewish identity itself, which persisted across centuries of dispersion.